the history of trains in Prescott. It's a history that goes back more than 200 years. The town was founded in 1810, and as a result of its strategic location, the first real commerce that developed in the town was the forwarding trade. The forwarding trade gave rise to several large businesses in Prescott, and the resulting prosperity ensured the viability of the town's future. In the 1820s, steamships came upon the scene, and the government realized that the rapids were going to be an impediment to the development of Upper Canada. And as a result, the government embarked on construction of a series of canals to bypass the rapids on the Upper St. Lawrence River. And they were finally completed in 1848. And at that time, the boats going up and down the river started to bypass Prescott, and the forwarding trade went into a serious decline. Now, the businessmen of Prescott realized that they were going to have to adopt other strategies in order to ensure the prosperity of the town. And fortuitously at this time, the railway industry became somewhat of a mania, in the sense that everywhere around Lower and Upper Canada, communities were trying to establish rail links to facilitate transportation and communication between their communities. This phenomenon had taken place several decades earlier in the United States, and earlier than that in England.
The railway revolution started in the late 1830s with the George Stephenson's locomotive called the Rocket, which basically set new land records for movement of both people and goods. The new technology, just like computer technology today, became what everybody wanted. There's discussions in Upper Canada as early as the 1839 about building a railway from Montreal to Prescott. The shipping system at the time were boats transloaded from the sailing ships on Lake Ontario to the small boats to go through the rapids to and from Montreal. Of course, railways were very capital intensive. Canada at the time did not have a large pool of wealth, so it was mostly talk. However, by the late 1840s, the provincial government has passed the Guarantee Act, which basically said that the province would underwrite half the cost for any bonds issued on a railway that was more than 75 miles long. This touched off a major industry of building railways in Upper Canada, and the Bytown in Prescott was one of them.
And in Prescott here, they looked to the north and saw this town of Bytown, and it was seeking outlets for its lumber products to markets abroad and in the U.S. Now at that time, prior to 1850, the lumber was shipped down the river to Montreal. But with the arrival of the possibility of having a railway connection to Prescott, the businesses here took advantage of our close proximity to Bytown. We're only 53 miles away, and the railway, if it was constructed between Bytown and Prescott, would offer a 12-month season for the shipment of lumber and lumber products. And also, along the routes of the proposed railway, there were many smaller agricultural communities that were looking for outlets for their products as well. So the company was called Bytown and Prescott Railway Company. It received a government charter in 1853. And in anticipation of that, the businessmen of Prescott, along with those in Bytown, set about to raise the necessary money in order to finance this railway.
Well, there were meetings of concerned citizens in both Bytown and Prescott and communities along the line to build interest in the railway, as well as to get people to subscribe to buying stock in the rail line. Stock sales, however, never amounted to a very large percentage of the money. Again, it was going to be bonds, and what the railways did was in 1852, the province passed the Municipal Loan Act that allowed communities to subscribe to bonds from the railway companies. Both Ottawa and Prescott bought into this to the extent that they really underwrote most of the construction cost of the railway. except for the cost of the rails on the rail line. Those were sent over by a company in Wales that agreed to be paid in bonds and took a mortgage out on the line.
Here I have in my hands an original share certificate for the Bytown and Prescott Railway Company. It's dated 1853, and it formed part of the shareholding raising that was done in order to finance the construction of the railway company. The capital indicated on the share certificate is £150,000 or $600,000. Now this particular certificate is for one share, which I believe was worth £10 at that time. With that done, they needed then to turn their attention to securing locomotives and railway cars. And the best place to find those at that time was in Boston. And so they went down to Boston and they procured 6 locomotives and 127 railway cars, including 6 passenger cars. The next thing the company had to do was to find an engineer in order to lay out the proposed route for the railway and to supervise the construction. They chose a man, Walter Shanley, who had just completed work on the Ogdensburg Railway, the New York Central that ran from Ogdensburg across the river from Prescott over to Rouse's Point in Quebec. Based on his experience, he was hired, and he and his brother, Francis Shanley, started work right away in 1853 to lay out the route. The route they chose was on the east side of the Rideau River, so that the railway would leave the north end of Prescott and go through Spencerville and then proceed up the east side of the Rideau River through communities like Manotick and Gloucester and arrive in the east end of Bytown.
The line was completed in December 1854. However, for the first decade, it had a very, very precarious financial existence. Traffic volumes were not what they had hoped. The river remained a barrier for moving the goods across it, and the waterborne transport basically cut its rates to compete with the railway to retain its share of the goods. The Bytown and Prescott underwent basically a bankruptcy type proceeding. It was seized by the creditors, and it actually shut down for many, many months while the creditors fought over whose claim would have precedence over the secured assets of the company. Then in 1865, they came to an agreement, both the Ottawa, Prescott, the Welsh Iron Company, and the Grand Trunk Railway, which also had a lien on the equipment that the Bytown and Prescott owned, came to an agreement to settle all the claims. The railway reopened to help the old Bytown and Prescott, which has gone through bankruptcy and is now called the St. Lawrence and Ottawa Railway. From 1867, it gets this new name. They joined together in another car line, which the Vermont Central Railway backs, to run cars of lumber from Ottawa through to New England. Now they have to move these cars across the river, because now they are actually going to move cars rather than transship stuff from rail car to boat back to rail car. A ferry boat is acquired. In 1873, they retire the first boat, which was called the St. Lawrence, basically because it had rotted out and no one had the money at the time to replace it. In 1874, there's a new boat called the Transit that comes on that shuffles the rail cars across the river. It's built with narrow gauge or standard gauge tracks on it to move the freight cars back and forth. It's a big success.
I'm looking at a picture. It's a photograph taken of my great-great-uncle, Samuel Dowsley, and his wife, Orina. Orina Dowsley was the daughter of Samuel Glasgow, who had been an early financier of the railway company, the Bytown and Prescott Railway Company. And Samuel Dowsley, his son-in-law, worked for that company for 46 years. He started just after the company had changed its name from the Ottawa and Prescott Railway to the St. Lawrence and Ottawa Railway. He continued working for them during that whole period, and when it was taken over by the CPR, he worked for the CPR until 1911. In all, he served 46 years with the railway, and on the occasion of his retirement, he was presented with a small bag of gold by the company and a letter giving testimony to his long and dedicated service. The other document I have is his reply. It's a letter in his own hand that was dated November 25th, 1911, and it was addressed to the employees of the CP company, outlining his career with the company and all the pleasure that he had derived from having served with these men over the years.